The snow fell heavily outside the windows of Elaine Murphy's diner. The small building stood alone on the edge of Clearwater, Nebraska, its warm yellow lights a beacon in the growing darkness. At 52 years old, Elaine had spent most of her life in this diner. Her grandmother had opened it, her mother had run it, and now it belonged to her. The year was 2087, and the world was not what it once had been. For the past 3 years, Earth had been fighting a war against an alien race called the Krell. Most of the battles happened in space or on distant planets where humans had settled, but Earth itself had become a base for military operations. Elaine wiped down the counter and glanced at the old-fashioned clock on the wall. It was almost closing time, and no customers had come in for the last 2 hours. The storm was getting worse. The weather report said it might be the biggest blizzard to hit Nebraska in 30 years. She thought about her son Keith, serving somewhere out among the stars on a military ship. She hadn't heard from him in 2 months. Every night she prayed. He was safe and warm wherever he was. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Elaine was about to turn off the open sign when she noticed movement in the distance. Squinting through the snow-covered glass, she saw dark shapes struggling through the deep drifts toward her diner. As they got closer, Elaine recognized the uniform design of the United Earth Defense Force. Soldiers, at least a dozen of them, fighting their way through the blizzard. Their environmental suits, designed for combat rather than extreme weather, were covered in ice. Elaine rushed to unlock the door as the first soldier reached the steps. The wind nearly tore the door from her hands as she pulled it open. "Get in. Here, all of you," she shouted over the storm. One by one, the soldiers stumbled into the warm diner. There were 14 in total, men and women of various ages, all wearing the blue and gray uniforms of the 7th Mechanized Infantry Division. Most looked young enough to be her children. "Thank you, ma'am," said a tall woman with lieutenant bars on her collar. Ice crystals had formed in her short brown hair. "Our transport crashed about 10 miles back. Navigation systems failed. Probably. Krell interference. Are any of you hurt?" Elaine asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Nothing serious. Mostly cold and hungry," the lieutenant replied. "I'm Lieutenant Carol Weber." "Elaine Murphy. This is my place." She gestured around the diner. "Take those wetsuits off and find a seat. I'll get some coffee going." The soldiers peeled off their outer gear, hanging it near the heaters to dry. They moved stiffly, their faces red from the cold. One young man could barely bend his fingers. Elaine fired up the grill and started cooking everything she had. Eggs, bacon, potatoes, pancakes, food that would warm them from the inside out. As she worked, she listened to the soldiers talk among themselves. "Communications are completely down," said a young woman with short blonde hair. Her name tag read, Grant. "The storm's not helping," replied a dark-skinned man who introduced himself as Private Sam Collins. "Even if base picks up our emergency beacon, no one's flying in this weather." Elaine brought out plates piled high with food. "Eat up," she said. "There's plenty more." The soldiers didn't need to be told twice. They ate like they hadn't seen food in days. "This is the best meal I've had since leaving Earth," said Private Collins between mouthfuls. "Military rations make you forget what real food tastes like." "How long have you been serving?" Elaine asked, pouring more coffee. 18 months, he replied. "Was in college when the Krell attacked the Jupiter colony. Signed up the next day." Specialist Heather Grant nodded. "Most of us did the same. This unit was formed right after the Battle of Mars." As they ate, the soldiers shared stories about their homes and families. Collins was from Detroit, the last of 5 children to leave home. Grant grew up in a small town in Oregon, not unlike Clearwater. Corporal Joe Mitchell had a wife and baby girl he'd only seen in video calls. Private Lisa Adams had joined up alongside, her twin brother who now served on a different planet. Elaine listened to every word, seeing her son Keith in each of their faces. These were someone's children, far from home, fighting a war against creatures from another world. When Lieutenant Weber finished eating, she approached the counter with a small digital device in hand. "Ma'am, I need to process payment for the meals. Standard military protocol." She held out the device. The Defense Department reimburses all services to military personnel. Just need to scan your business ID. Elaine looked at the payment device, then at the young faces scattered around her diner. Some had already fallen asleep in the booths, exhausted from their ordeal. Others were talking quietly, enjoying this brief moment of peace and normalcy. She gently pushed the device back toward the lieutenant. Not tonight. I'm sorry? Lieutenant Weber looked confused. Tonight, you're not soldiers who need to file expense reports. Tonight, you're just people who need warming up. Elaine smiled. My boy Keith is out there somewhere in a uniform like yours. I like to think if he was cold and hungry, someone would take care of him without worrying about getting paid. But, regulations state, I've been running this diner for 30 years, Lieutenant. I think I can decide who pays and who doesn't. Lieutenant Weber hesitated, then slowly put the payment device away. Thank you. We won't forget this. As the night grew deeper and the storm raged on, Elaine brought out blankets and pillows from the small apartment above the diner. The soldiers made themselves comfortable wherever they could find space. Before turning in herself, Elaine stood by the window, watching the snow bury the world outside. In the reflection of the glass, she could see the sleeping soldiers, someone's children, all of them. Stay safe, Keith, she whispered to the storm. Wherever you are. Elaine didn't know that her simple act of kindness would trigger events beyond her imagination. She didn't know that military regulations had been tightened due to Krell infiltration tactics. She didn't know that refusing to bill military personnel was now flagged as suspicious behavior in the Defense Department's security systems. She didn't know that by morning, her quiet street would become the focus of military attention, and her life would never be the same. For now, she was just a mother who missed her son, taking care of young people who reminded her of him. For now, it was enough to provide warmth and food on a cold winter night, asking nothing in return. That night, Elaine slept in the booth nearest the door, keeping watch over her unexpected guests like a mother hen with her chicks. Outside, the storm continued to rage, hiding them all from the stars and whatever watched from beyond them. Elaine woke to the sound of heavy engines. She sat up quickly, her back stiff from sleeping in the booth. Through the frost-covered windows, she could see the first light of dawn breaking over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, but something was happening outside. Large military vehicles lined both ends of her street. Soldiers in winter combat gear were setting up barriers and checkpoint stations. What in the world? She muttered, standing to get a better look. Lieutenant Weber was already awake, peering out through a gap in the curtains. The other soldiers were stirring now too, alerted by the commotion outside. That's a security detail, Lieutenant Weber said, her voice tight. Full containment protocol. Private Collins joined them at the window. Why would they send a security team? We just got stranded in a storm. Elaine opened the door and stepped onto her porch. The cold morning air bit at her face. At both ends of the street, soldiers were directing traffic away. Civilians who lived on the street were being stopped, asked for identification, and questioned before being allowed to pass. A large command vehicle pulled up in front of the diner. The door opened and a man in a captain's uniform stepped out. He was tall, with short gray hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a frown. 2 more officers followed him, along with several people carrying equipment and computers. Captain Gregory Phillips, Military Security Division, the man announced as he approached Elaine. Are you Elaine Murphy, owner of this establishment? I am, Elaine replied, crossing her arms against the cold. What's going on, Captain? Why? Are all these soldiers on my street? Instead of answering, Captain Phillips turned to Lieutenant Weber, who had come outside behind Elaine. Lieutenant, you and your unit need to report to medical for evaluation immediately. Transport is waiting. Yes, sir, Lieutenant Weber replied, though she looked confused. She turned to Elaine. Thank you again for your help, Ms. Murphy. As the soldiers gathered their gear and prepared to leave, Captain Phillips gestured for Elaine to go back inside. We need to talk, Ms. Murphy. Inside the diner, soldiers were already setting up equipment. They were installing small devices in the corners of the room and connecting them to portable computers. Others were examining her security cameras and register system. What is all this? Elaine demanded. You can't just come in here and take over my diner. Captain Phillips sat down at one of the booths and motioned for her to join him. Ms. Murphy, are you aware that you violated military financial protocols last night? Elaine blinked in surprise. By not charging for some food? That's why you've shut down my street? It's more complicated than that, Phillips said. We're at war, Ms. Murphy. The Krell aren't just fighting us with ships and weapons. They're using infiltration, manipulation, and psychological tactics. One of the officers brought Phillips a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and then showed it to Elaine. It displayed the security footage from her diner, showing the moment when she had pushed away Lieutenant Weber's payment device. 3 weeks ago, we discovered a Krell infiltrator operating near the Carson military base in Arizona. They had disguised themselves as a human restaurant owner. They were using a form of mind-altering substance in the food to extract information from military personnel, Phillips explained. Since then, any deviation from standard protocols involving military personnel and civilian food service is automatically flagged as a potential security risk. Elaine stared at him in disbelief. You think I'm some kind of alien spy because I gave free food to freezing soldiers? We don't think anything yet, Ms. Murphy. That's why we're here, to investigate. He gestured around the diner. The security team will need to examine your food supplies, your cooking equipment, and your business records. They'll also need to take samples from you. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. Elaine watched as soldiers began going door to door along her street, speaking with her neighbors. How long will this take? She asked. Depends on what we find, Phillips replied. For now, you can continue to operate your business, but under supervision. My team will remain on site, and you'll need to follow strict protocols for all food preparation. The bell above the door jingled as it opened. A group of regular customers, mostly local farmers and town workers, stopped in their tracks when they saw the military presence. Morning, Elaine, said Bill Harper, an older man who ran the local hardware store. His eyes darted nervously between the soldiers. Everything okay? Before Elaine could answer, Captain Phillips stood up. This establishment is under military investigation. You're welcome to eat here, but be advised that security protocols are in effect. The customers exchanged worried glances. Most of them mumbled excuses and left quickly. Only Bill remained. Elaine, he asked, concern in his voice. It's fine, Bill, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Just a misunderstanding about those soldiers who stayed here during the storm last night. Bill nodded slowly. Word's already spreading about what you did for them. Mary at the grocery store said her nephew is in that unit. Said you were a godsend. Captain Phillips cleared his throat. Mr. Harper, is it? We'll need to ask you some questions about your relationship with Ms. Murphy and this establishment. Now wait just a minute, Elaine protested. Bill's got nothing to do with this. Everyone who has regular contact with you is relevant to our investigation, Phillips stated. The Krell are known to work through networks of influence. As the morning progressed, more of Elaine's neighbors were brought in for questioning. Military personnel had taken over the vacant building next door, converting it into a temporary command center with scanning equipment and interrogation rooms. Around noon, Elaine received a call from Mayor Paul Thompson. Elaine, what in heaven's name is going on? He asked. Half the town is talking about the army taking over your diner. They think I might be an alien spy because I didn't charge those soldiers last night, Elaine said, keeping her voice low even though she knew the soldiers could probably hear every word. There was a pause on the line. That's ridiculous. Look, I'm going to make some calls. My brother-in-law works at the regional military headquarters. Maybe he can sort this out. Thank you, Paul, Elaine said, feeling a small measure of relief. Throughout the day, curious townspeople drove by slowly, trying to see what was happening. Some of Elaine's most loyal customers braved the military presence to come in for lunch, making a point to tell her loudly how much they appreciated her diner and her cooking. By evening, the whole street had been transformed. Temporary lights illuminated the area and patrols moved back and forth. Residents were required to show identification every time they entered or left their homes. Elaine stood at her window as darkness fell, watching the soldiers and thinking about her son Keith, somewhere out among the stars. She wondered what he would think of all this, his mother being investigated as a potential alien threat. She touched the small picture of Keith she kept near the register. "What a mess," she whispered to his smiling face. "All because I didn't want to charge those kids for some eggs and coffee." Outside, the military vehicles cast long shadows in the artificial light, and Elaine wondered how long this would last, and what tomorrow would bring. 3 days had passed since the military took over Elaine Street. Her diner remained open, but half the tables were now occupied by soldiers monitoring every customer and conversation. Captain Phillips had set up his command post in the corner, booth, where he could watch everything that happened. The people of Clearwater had responded in their own way. Despite the military checkpoints, locals made a point of coming to eat at Elaine's diner. They arrived in small groups throughout the day, filling the place with familiar faces and supportive words. Elaine was wiping down the counter when Captain Phillips approached her for what had become their daily interview. "Let's talk in the back," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. Elaine followed him, aware of the cameras that had been installed throughout her diner. In the kitchen, 2 soldiers were examining her food supplies and taking samples from everything. "Ms. Murphy, Captain," Phillips began, "our investigation has uncovered some concerning patterns." He placed a tablet on the counter. The screen showed a list of dates and times over the past year, each marked with a red flag. "These are instances where military personnel visited your establishment, but there's no record of payment being processed," Phillips said. "Can you explain that?" Elaine looked at the dates. "I don't need to check my records to explain. Yes, sometimes soldiers come through town, and sometimes I don't charge them, especially the young ones who look like they could use a good meal. So you admit this is a pattern of behavior?" "If being kind is a pattern, then yes," Elaine replied. "My boy Keith is out there somewhere, and I hope if he's ever cold and hungry, someone will feed him without thinking about the money." Phillips frowned. "Ms. Murphy, you don't seem to understand the seriousness of this situation. The Krell have been known to use human sympathies against us. They create situations where humans feel compelled to help, creating bonds of gratitude that can be exploited." "Captain, I've been running this diner for 30 years, Elaine said. "I was feeding people long before the Krell showed up. It's what I do." Before Phillips could respond, one of his officers entered the kitchen. "Sir, we found something," the officer said, handing Phillips a small device. "What is that?" Elaine asked. "It's a data storage unit," Phillips replied, examining it closely. "Where was this found?" "Hidden behind the refrigerator, sir." Elaine stared at the device. "That's not mine. I've never seen it before." Phillips gave her a hard look. "We'll need to analyze its contents. If there's any communication with Krell frequencies—" "This is ridiculous," Elaine exclaimed. "You think I'm hiding alien technology behind my refrigerator? That thing was probably left by the repairman who came last month." Outside in the diner, the bell above the door rang as Mayor Paul Thompson entered. He was accompanied by several town council members and Frank Peterson, who owned the hardware store. The group made their way directly to the kitchen, ignoring the soldiers who tried to stop them. "Captain Phillips," Mayor Thompson said firmly, "we need to talk about what's happening here." Phillips straightened. "Mayor, this is a military security operation. Civilian interference is not welcome." "This is my town, Captain," Thompson replied. "And Elaine Murphy is one of our most respected citizens. Whatever investigation you're conducting needs to be wrapped up. You're disrupting the entire community." Frank Peterson stepped forward. "You want to know why Elaine doesn't charge soldiers? Sometimes. We all do it. My hardware store gives military discounts that don't show up in the official system. Linda Alvarez at the motel lets soldiers stay for free if they're just passing through for a night." "It's how small towns work, Captain," Mayor Thompson added. "We take care of our own, and we consider those kids in uniform to be our own too." Phillips looked between them. "Those are all security violations that need to be reported." "Oh, for heaven's sake," Elaine said. "The world won't end because some small-town folks are nice to soldiers." A commotion from the front of the diner interrupted them. Elaine pushed past the group to see what was happening. To her surprise, Private Sam Collins and Specialist Heather Grant were standing by the counter in their uniforms, arguing with the guards. "These two say they know you," one of the soldiers said to Elaine. They stayed here during the storm, Elaine confirmed. Private Collins stepped forward. Ms. Murphy, we heard about what's happening. Our whole unit did. They've been questioning us for days about that night. They wanted to know if you put anything in our food or if you asked us questions about military movements, Grant added. It's crazy. Captain Phillips emerged from the kitchen. Collins, Grant, you're supposed to be at Fort Carson. What are you doing here? We were granted weekend leave, sir, Collins explained. We came to check on Ms. Murphy. And to thank her. Properly, Grant said, placing a small package on the counter. This is from all of us. Elaine unwrapped the package to find a handmade card signed by all 14 soldiers who had stayed at her diner, along with a small pin in the shape of their unit insignia. My father is Colonel Jack Collins, Private Collins said, addressing Captain Phillips directly. He served 30 years before retiring last year. When I told him what Ms. Murphy did for us and how you were treating her, he made some calls. Phillips' expression changed. Colonel Collins from Special Operations Command? Yes, sir. He knows a thing or two about Krell infiltration tactics. And he says they don't involve little old ladies running diners in the middle of nowhere. A soldier rushed in from the command center next door. Captain, we've got a priority communication from headquarters. Phillips followed the soldier out, leaving Elaine with Collins and Grant. I'm sorry about all this, Collins said quietly. They're paranoid about Krell infiltrators. 3 weeks ago, they found one running a restaurant near Fort Carson. The alien was using some kind of drug in the food to make soldiers talk about classified information. But that doesn't mean everyone who's kind to a soldier is an alien, Grant added. Outside, more townspeople had begun to gather. They stood at the military barriers holding signs that read, Free Elaine Street, and Kindness is not a crime. Linda Alvarez from the motel was handing out coffee to people in the cold, while other business owners brought food and chairs. Captain Phillips returned, his face harder than before. The device we found contains encrypted data. We're sending it to the lab for analysis. Until we have results, this investigation continues. Mayor Thompson shook his head. Captain, look outside. The people of this town are not going to stand by while you treat Elaine like a criminal. If you want to investigate someone for being kind to soldiers, you'll have to investigate all of us. Elaine looked out at her neighbors and friends standing in the cold, then back at Collins and Grant, who had risked their weekend leave to come support her. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: she was not alone. Captain, she said firmly, your soldiers can watch me all day long. They can check every egg I crack and every cup of coffee I pour. But they'll never find what you're looking for, because it's not here. I'm just a woman who misses her son and sees him in every young soldier who walks through that door. The standoff continued as the day wore on, neither side willing to back down. But something had shifted in Clearwater. What had started as an investigation into one woman had become a test of strength for an entire community. On the fourth day, Elaine woke before dawn. She had barely slept, worrying about the strange device found in her kitchen and what it might contain. If the military decided it was alien technology, what would happen to her? Would they shut down her diner permanently? Would they take her away for more questioning? She made coffee and began preparing for the day, soldiers watching her every move. By now she had almost gotten used to their presence, though she still jumped whenever one of them moved suddenly or spoke into their communication devices. At precisely 8 o'clock, a sleek black vehicle pulled up outside the diner. The soldiers at the checkpoint snapped to attention as a woman stepped out. She was tall with short silver hair and wore a uniform with general's stars on the shoulders. Captain Phillips rushed outside to meet her, saluting sharply. They spoke briefly before he led her toward the diner. Elaine quickly wiped her hands on her apron and straightened her hair. The bell jingled as they entered. The soldiers inside all stood at attention. Ms. Murphy, Captain Phillips said, his voice unusually formal. This is General Diana Coleman, head of Homeland Security Operations. General Coleman approached Elaine and extended her hand. Ms. Murphy, I apologize for interrupting your morning. I'd like to speak with you privately if that's possible. Elaine glanced at Captain Phillips, who nodded stiffly. We can use my office in the back, she said, leading the way. Her office was small, just enough room for a desk and 2 chairs. The military had installed cameras here too, but General Coleman tapped a device on her wrist, and a soft buzzing filled the room. "Privacy field," she explained. "Now we can talk freely." "Am I in trouble?" Elaine asked directly. General Coleman smiled slightly. "No, Ms. Murphy, you're not in trouble. In fact, I'm here to resolve this situation." "What about that device they found in my kitchen?" "That's part of what I need to discuss with you." The general sat down, gesturing for Elaine to do the same. "First, I want to explain why Captain Phillips and his team reacted so strongly to your refusal to bill those soldiers." She took out a small tablet and showed Elaine a photograph of what looked like a normal human man in a chef's uniform. "This is, or was, the owner of a restaurant called Homestead Grill near Fort Carson. 3 weeks ago, we discovered he was actually a Krell infiltrator using a human disguise." Elaine stared at the photo. "He looks completely normal." "The Krell have perfected their disguises," General Coleman said. "This infiltrator had been operating for 6 months. He used a special compound in his food, tasteless, odorless, that made soldiers more talkative, more willing to share classified information. We believe he collected data on troop movements, weapon systems, and defense plans before we caught him." "That's terrible," Elaine said. "But what does that have to do with me not charging for some food?" "After we discovered the infiltrator, new security protocols were implemented. Any deviation from standard procedures involving military personnel and civilian establishments is flagged for investigation, especially food service." The general sighed. "The system is designed to catch patterns that might indicate Krell activity. Your actions triggered multiple flags. So this is all just because of some computer system?" "Partly," General Coleman admitted. "But there's more to it." She leaned forward. "That device they found in your kitchen? It's not Krell technology." "It's ours." Elaine blinked in surprise. "What?" "It's a military surveillance device planted here 6 months ago during routine security sweeps of all businesses near military transport routes." The general's expression was serious. "We've been monitoring many civilian establishments since the war began. It's not something we're proud of, but it's deemed necessary for security." "You've been spying on me? On my customers?" Elaine felt anger rising in her chest. "Monitoring, not spying. The devices only activate when military personnel are present, and they only record certain types of information, chemical signatures mainly, looking for Krell compounds." General Coleman held up a hand. "I know this sounds invasive, and it is, but we're fighting an enemy that can look exactly like us, Ms. Murphy, an enemy that uses our trust and compassion against us." Before Elaine could respond, the diner's ancient television, which was always tuned to the news, suddenly blared with an emergency broadcast signal. Both women turned to look. "We interrupt this program for breaking news," the announcer said gravely. "The United Earth Defense Force has confirmed a major battle has taken place in the Proxima Centauri system. Early reports indicate significant casualties as human forces engaged a Krell battle fleet. The full extent of losses is still unknown, but military sources describe the engagement as a devastating setback. Casualty lists will be released once next of kin have been notified." Elaine felt her heart stop. Keith was stationed in the Proxima Centauri system. Her hands began to shake. General Coleman noticed immediately. "You have someone out there." "My son," Elaine whispered. "He's on the USS Horizon." The general's wrist device beeped. She checked it, then stood quickly. "I need to take this. Please excuse me, Ms. Murphy." As the general left the office, Elaine remained seated, her eyes fixed on the television. The news had moved on to showing footage of earlier battles, with reporters speculating about what this defeat might mean for the war effort. Captain Phillips appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Murphy, are you all right?" Elaine couldn't answer. All she could think about was Keith, and whether he was still alive. Outside the diner, the crowd of townspeople had grown larger. Word of General Coleman's arrival had spread quickly. Mayor Thompson and the town council stood at the front, waiting for news. Inside, the soldiers watched as Elaine finally emerged from her office. Her face was pale, her eyes red. "My son," she said simply, and many of the soldiers lowered their eyes in understanding. They all knew what the news report meant. Private Collins approached her. "Ms. Murphy, which ship did you say your son is on?" "The USS Horizon," she replied. "He's a communications specialist." Collins exchanged a glance with Specialist Grant. "The Horizon was reported to be on the edge of the battle zone, not in the main engagement area." "There's a good chance—" "Don't," Elaine said sharply. "Don't give me false hope. I've seen enough military faces to know when bad news is coming." General Coleman returned, her expression now grave and official. "Captain Phillips, I have new orders for you." The entire diner fell silent, everyone waiting to hear what would happen next. "The security alert for this location is being downgraded," General Coleman announced. "Effective immediately, you will begin dismantling the checkpoint operations and return this street to normal civilian control." Phillips looked surprised. "General, what about the investigation? The encrypted data?" "That's classified, Captain." The general cut him off. "Your team will maintain minimal surveillance of this establishment, but the full security protocol is no longer required." She turned to Elaine. "Ms. Murphy, I apologize for the disruption to your business and your community. The military will provide compensation for any losses you've incurred." Elaine barely heard her. Her mind was still on the news report, on Keith, on the casualty lists that would soon be released. General Coleman seemed to understand. She placed a hand briefly on Elaine's shoulder. "War makes us suspicious of the very things that make us human, Ms. Murphy. Kindness becomes a potential weakness to be exploited. Trust becomes a vulnerability. But sometimes I think those are the very things we're fighting to protect." The general moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Captain Phillips will give you the details of the compensation package. And Ms. Murphy, when those casualty lists come in, I'll make sure you know about your son immediately." With that, she was gone, leaving Elaine standing in her diner, surrounded by soldiers who were now preparing to leave and townspeople who were cautiously celebrating their victory. But for Elaine, none of it mattered. All she could think about was Keith, and whether she would ever see him again. Dawn broke over Clearwater, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. For the first time in 5 days, there were no military barriers on Elaine Street. The checkpoints had been removed overnight, and most of the soldiers were gone. Only a small team remained, dismantling the last of their equipment from the vacant building next door. Elaine hadn't slept. She had spent the night sitting by her phone, waiting for news about Keith. No call had come. The official casualty lists hadn't been released yet, which could be good news or simply a delay in processing the information. She opened the diner out of habit, going through the motions of starting coffee and preparing the kitchen. A few of the regular morning customers trickled in, speaking in hushed tones and offering sympathetic smiles. "Any word about Keith?" asked Bill Harper, as he took his usual seat at the counter. Elaine shook her head. "Nothing yet." "No news is good news," Bill said, though his voice lacked conviction. Captain Phillips entered the diner. He looked tired, his uniform slightly rumpled. He had been up all night supervising the withdrawal of his forces. "Ms. Murphy," he said, approaching the counter. "I wanted to check on you before I leave." "That's thoughtful of you, Captain," Elaine replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. After everything that had happened, she found she couldn't stay angry with him. He had just been doing his job, following orders in a world that had been turned upside down by an alien enemy. "I want to apologize," Phillips said, surprising her. "I was so focused on security protocols that I forgot what we're really fighting for." Elaine gave him a small smile. "We all get caught up in rules sometimes. Coffee's on the house." Phillips shook his head. "No, I'm paying." He placed money on the counter. Full price, plus a tip. Outside, the sound of engines drew their attention. A military transport had pulled up in front of the diner. It was smaller than the command vehicles that had been there before, just a standard personnel carrier. "Are you expecting more soldiers?" Elaine asked, her heart suddenly racing. Military vehicles often brought news about casualties. "No," Phillips frowned. My orders were to withdraw all forces except for the minimal surveillance team. They watched as the transport's door opened. A soldier stepped out, a lieutenant holding a datapad. He spoke briefly to the driver, then turned toward the diner. 3 more figures emerged from the transport behind him. Elaine squinted through the window, trying to make out their faces in the early morning light. The lieutenant approached the diner, followed by the others. The bell jingled as the door opened. Elaine froze, coffee pot still in hand. Are you Elaine Murphy? The lieutenant asked. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The lieutenant nodded and stepped aside. Behind him stood a tall young man in a military uniform, his face tired but smiling. Keith? Elaine gasped, the coffee pot slipping from her fingers and crashing to the floor. Hi, Mom, Keith Murphy said, his voice thick with emotion. Elaine rushed around the counter and threw her arms around her son, hardly believing he was real. He was thinner than she remembered, with a new scar above his right eyebrow, but he was alive and standing in her diner. How? Why? The battle. She couldn't form complete sentences through her tears. Emergency leave, Keith explained, holding his mother tight. General Coleman arranged it. She said you needed to see me and I needed to see you. Behind Keith stood Private Collins and Specialist Grant, both smiling at the reunion. Your friends? Told me what happened here, Keith said, looking at Collins and Grant. About the storm and you feeding them and all the trouble it caused. Captain Phillips approached them. Your mother's kindness triggered an investigation, but in the end, it led to something important. He looked at the lieutenant. What's that you're holding, Lieutenant? The lieutenant handed the datapad to Captain Phillips. New orders from General Coleman, sir. Phillips read the datapad, his eyebrows rising in surprise. This is unexpected. What is it? Elaine asked, still holding on to Keith as if he might disappear. It's called the Clearwater Protocol, Phillips explained, showing her the screen. A new initiative allowing registered civilian establishments to provide support to military personnel without formal billing. Instead, these establishments will receive a monthly stipend and supply allocation. Elaine read the official military directive, signed by General Coleman herself. I don't understand. They're changing the rules because of me? Not just because of you, the lieutenant said. General Coleman reviewed the entire security approach after what happened here. She realized something important. The human connections and community support that give our soldiers strength cannot be regulated or controlled by protocols. These connections are actually our greatest advantage over the Krell. The Krell operate as a hive mind, Keith explained. They don't have individual bonds or emotional ties like we do. They can mimic human behavior, but they can't understand why a diner owner in a small town would feed tired soldiers without expecting payment. Collins stepped forward. We told everyone in our unit about what you did, Ms. Murphy, and how the military responded. The story spread. They're calling it Elaine's Stand now. General Coleman believes we've been fighting this war the wrong way, the lieutenant continued. We've been so focused on preventing Krell infiltration that we've been undermining the very things that make us human. Our connections to each other, our communities, our compassion. The Clearwater Protocol is just the beginning, Grant added. They're re-evaluating all the security measures that have been driving wedges between soldiers and civilians. Outside, the people of Clearwater had begun to gather. Word had spread quickly that Keith was home and that the military blockade was truly over. Mayor Thompson stood at the front of the crowd, grinning widely. Mom, Keith said, there's something else you should know about the battle at Proxima Centauri. Elaine tensed, preparing herself for bad news. It wasn't the devastating defeat they initially reported, Keith explained. The Horizon and 3 other ships managed to hold a defensive position that allowed the civilian transports to escape. We lost some ships, but we saved over 20,000 colonists. And there's more, Collins added. The Krell retreated after the battle. Intelligence thinks they were surprised by how hard our forces fought to protect the civilian ships. They don't understand that kind of sacrifice. Elaine looked around at the faces in her diner. Her son, The soldiers who had become her friends. Captain Phillips, who had begun to understand what they were really fighting for. And beyond the windows, her neighbors and community who had stood by her through it all. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now," Keith said with a smile, "I have 3 days of leave to spend with my mother, and I could really use some of your famous pancakes." Elaine laughed through her tears. "Coming right up." As she moved back behind, the counter, Elaine's diner, began to fill with townspeople and soldiers, all talking and laughing together. The barriers between them, both physical and emotional, had begun to come down. In a war against aliens who could not comprehend human compassion and connection, perhaps these qualities were humanity's most powerful weapons after all. And it had started right here, with a simple act of kindness on a cold winter night, an act that reminded everyone what they were really fighting for.